Welcome to this deep dive. Everybody seems to be asking, is social media actually good or bad for how we communicate? And you know what? You've given us a really interesting mix of stuff to work through this time, personal stories, expert opinions, even some historical perspective.
Yeah, it really is a complex talk. The answer isn't a simple yes or no. But looking at it from different angles, I think we can at least understand things a bit better. Maybe even help you communicate more effectively in our digital world.
Okay, so let's jump right in. One source that really caught my eye was Chad Littlefield's analogy, talking about sips versus gulps of connection. I think that's a pretty clever way to think about how social media interactions often feel kind of shallow.
It's so true because on the surface, it seems like we're more connected than ever. We can talk to people across the world, share our thoughts and experiences with everyone. But are those constant pings and all that perfectly curated stuff we see actually stopping us from connecting on a deeper level?
Do you think that's too simple an analogy, though? Because those little sips can be nice, right? Just quick little interactions throughout the day.
You're right. There's definitely a balance, I think. A few sips can be refreshing. But if that's all we ever do, we might be missing out on those deeper, more meaningful gulps, the kind of connection that really matters.
So how do we find that balance then, especially when social media makes it so easy to just keep scrolling and sipping?
Well, Littlefield suggests a couple of things, like using those screen time management tools you can get on your phone. That can help us realize how much time we're actually spending online.
Yeah, that's a pretty common suggestion, but I've also heard people say that just treats the symptom, not the problem. Like maybe we need to figure out why we can't seem to put our phones down in the first place.
Totally agree. Getting to the root of the problem is key, but sometimes just realizing what our habits are can be a great first step to actually changing them. Littlefield also mentioned something called a news feed. Was it a news feed eradicator, I think? Have you heard of that?
A newsfeed? What? Now that's a new one on me.
It's like a browser extension that blocks the news feed on social media.
Wow, that sounds extreme. I can see how that would force you to use social media differently, though. Instead of passively scrolling, you actually have to choose who and what you want to see.
Exactly. It's about taking back control.
This actually connects to something else Littlefield talked about, the accessibility of everything. Because of social media, we have access to information and conversations from all over the planet. It's pretty amazing if you think about it.
It really is. Just a few hundred years ago, your world would have been so much smaller. The people you interacted with, the stuff you talked about, everything was limited to what was around you.
But these days, before you even finish your coffee, you've probably already seen tons of news headlines, opinions, and yeah, probably a few cat videos too.
And that takes us to the other side of this coin. Another source, how social media is changing the way we communicate, highlighted the downside of this accessibility. It's like having a fire hose of information constantly pointed at us.
That can be exciting but exhausting too. Like, it's incredible to connect with people and learn about stuff happening everywhere, but it can also be overwhelming, even make you anxious sometimes.
Definitely a double-edged sword. And it's not just the amount of information, it's also the type. We're exposed to the best and worst of humanity all at once: achievements, tragedies, drama. It's a lot to handle.
So, is social media making us more empathetic, or are we just getting desensitized to everything?
That is the question, isn't it? I think there's a possibility of both.
Okay, I'm curious. Tell me more about the empathy angle.
Well, one source argued that social media can actually help us be more empathetic because we get to see the world through so many different lenses and experience things we might never have otherwise.
That makes sense, but then you've got that whole echo chamber thing. Everyone's talking about it, where the algorithms just show you more of what you already believe.
Right, and that's where things get tricky. Instead of opening our minds, we can end up stuck in these online bubbles where we only see stuff that agrees with us.
So can you even become more empathetic in that kind of environment?
I think it takes effort. It means recognizing that those echo chambers exist and then actually seeking out different opinions and challenging our own assumptions.
Okay, so we can't just passively absorb whatever we're being shown. We need to be more active and use a bit more critical thinking when we're using social media.
Exactly. And that leads us to another really interesting part of all this: how social media is changing how we communicate at a very basic level.
You mean all the abbreviations and emojis and internet slang? I have to admit, sometimes it feels like learning a whole new language.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how social media is shaping language? Some people might say it's ruining language, but others say it's a natural evolution, adapting to how quick and informal online communication is.
So is it evolution or devolution? I mean, have you noticed how often you use emojis even when texting people you see all the time? Or how abbreviations like LO and OMEG have snuck into how we talk?
It's definitely blurring the lines. And that brings us to a pretty big concern that one source had. They actually said that social media is destroying society.
Whoa, that's a pretty strong opinion.
It is. And while that might be a little extreme, there are some valid concerns about how this is impacting younger generations, especially since they're developing their communication skills mostly in this digital world.
Are we losing the subtleties of face-to-face interaction, the ability to read body language and tone of voice? It's definitely something to think about.
Absolutely. And that worry leads us directly into another big theme that came up in the sources, the impact of social media on mental health.
And of course, we can't talk about that without mentioning the Surgeon General's warning, right? It's scary to hear that teens who spend more than 3 hours a day on social media are at a higher risk for mental health problems.
It is. And teens open up about the impact of social media on their lives. We heard directly from young people who are dealing with anxieties about body image, self-esteem, sleep, all because of how they use social media.
It makes you wonder how much of that is caused by always being connected. The pressure to be on all the time and have this perfect online persona, it must be exhausting.
It could be social media and your mental health offer some practical advice for dealing with all this. They say to think about which online interactions make you feel good and which ones make you feel bad. Then make a plan to change your social media experience based on that.
So being more mindful about who we follow, what we read, and how much time we spend online, it's like we're talking about having a healthier relationship with social media.
Exactly, because let's face it, social media isn't going anywhere. We need to figure out how to use it so that it benefits us instead of controlling us.
I like that. It benefits us instead of controlling us. That's a really important point to keep in mind as we continue this deep dive.
Absolutely, there's still so much more to explore.
Well, then let's keep going.
One source compared social media apps to slot machines.
Oh, really? That's an interesting comparison. How so?
Well, they were talking about how addictive those apps can be, how all the scrolling and notifications kind of trigger those reward centers in our brains, just like gambling does.
It's like we keep hitting that refresh button, hoping to get a little dopamine rush.
Yeah, exactly, and that can lead to a cycle of dependence that's really hard to break.
So how do we resist the temptation then, the pull of the social media slot machine?
One idea was to put all those apps in a folder on your phone and then label the folder slot machine.
Ha, I like that. It's a visual reminder either time you reach for it.
Right, it makes you more aware of how much you're actually using them. But beyond individual strategies, how social media is destroying society, I had a point that really stuck with me, even though that title's a little over the top, don't you think?
Yeah, maybe a bit dramatic. What was the point they made?
They said that social media is here to stay, whether we like it or not. So instead of trying to get rid of it, we need to figure out how to manage it. It's not about rejecting technology.
It's about figuring out how to have a healthier relationship with it.
Right, exactly. And Teens Open Up offered some good advice from the experts. They talked about the importance of parental controls, especially for younger kids.
To help them set some boundaries, because kids aren't always the best at self-regulating.
That's true. The experts also said it's really important to talk openly about online experiences, both good and bad, so that teens feel comfortable talking to adults about what they're dealing with.
Which means that we as adults need to practice what we preach, right? It's hard to tell your kids to put their phones down when you're always on yours.
So true actions speak louder than words. One story that really got to me was about this young woman who quit social media for 2 years.
Because it was affecting her mental health that badly.
Yeah, she was struggling with an eating disorder and realized that all the stuff you're seeing on Instagram, all those pictures focused on bodies and losing weight, were making it worse.
It's a good reminder that social media can really mess with how we see the world, especially when it comes to things like body image.
For sure, and it's not just about how we look. Other teens in the article talked about being cyberbullied, the pressure to look perfect online, and that fear of missing out.
If FOMO, yeah, those are all real problems. It shows how important it is to have those open conversations with young people, not just about the dangers, but also about how to develop healthy habits online.
And it's not just young people. Adults can be just as vulnerable to the negative effects of social media.
Oh, yeah. Feeling overwhelmed by all the information, comparing yourself to other people that need to be on all the time. We've all been there.
And it's so important to remember that what we see on social media is usually a carefully crafted, idealized version of reality.
And then we end up feeling bad about ourselves because our lives don't measure up.
Exactly. So how do we develop a healthier relationship with social media for ourselves and for the next generation? It's a tough question.
Well, going back to being more intentional, one expert suggested choosing specific groups or pages to follow instead of just endlessly scrolling through your newsfeed.
That's a good way to control what you see. Focus on stuff that actually interests you and connect with people who share your interests.
And it can help you feel like you belong to a community online, which can be really helpful if you're feeling isolated in your offline life.
Another tip was to pay attention to how social media makes you feel. If you start to feel envious or anxious or sad after scrolling through your feed, maybe it's time to take a break.
Or unfollow or mute those accounts that trigger those negative feelings. There's nothing wrong with that.
Taking care of your mental health is so important. But you know what really resonated with me? The idea of rediscovering how great it is to interact with people face to face.
It's easy to get lost in the digital world and forget how important those real-life connections are.
Right, you miss out on all the subtleties of body language, tone, of voice, shared experiences. You just can't get that online.
But how do we make time for that with our busy lives?
You have to make it a priority. Schedule time to meet up with friends, have dinner with family. Even just put your phone away and really focus when you are together.
Like those gulps of connection we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Remember, it's about quality, not quantity. Even small moments of real connection can make a big difference in how we feel overall.
Now, before we move on, I want to go back to something we touched on earlier, that whole idea of how language is evolving in the digital age.
Oh, yeah. All the abbreviations, emojis, and internet slang. That is fascinating.
Some people think it's the end of proper English, but others see it as a natural development language adapting to a new era.
I think language has always been changing. It evolves to fit the needs of the time.
It's like, are we less articulate or just more efficient? I mean, you can say so much with just one emoji.
That's true. Emojis add a whole new dimension to communication. They're changing how we express ourselves.
This makes me think about the history of all this. The evolution of communication through social media took us on a fun little trip down memory lane.
It did, from MSN Messenger and Napster to MySpace and AIM. It's amazing how much has changed in such a short time.
Remember those away messages and how much effort we put into choosing our screen names? It feels like forever ago.
It's like a digital time capsule, but it also shows how those early platforms led to what we have today.
They introduced things like online profiles, instant messaging, sharing stuff with a wider audience, things we take for granted now.
It's been quite a journey from those early chat rooms to the massive social networks we have now. And who knows what's next?
So where do we go from here? What does the future hold for social media and how it affects communication? It's hard to even imagine.
It is. But one thing's for sure, social media will keep changing and shaping how we connect, interact, and communicate.
And we have to be aware of its influence, both the good and the bad, and learn how to use it to make our lives better, not worse.
We need to be smart about the information we take in, communicate thoughtfully, and encourage healthy tech habits in ourselves and future generations.
It's all about finding that balance between the digital world and the real world, and using social media's power for good.
Could have said it better myself. Now, before we get too philosophical.
Right. We don't want to go down that rabbit hole. How about we recap what we've talked about so far?
Sounds good. Let's highlight some key takeaway from this deep dive.
All right, key takeaways. Where do we even start?
I think the first one is pretty obvious. Social media is powerful, but it's not good or bad on its own. I mean, it can connect us, inform us, even inspire us. But it can also distract us, divide us, and even make us see the world in a distorted way.
Like they say, with great power comes great responsibility.
Right, exactly. And that responsibility is on each of us. We've talked a lot about being intentional with how we use social media, setting boundaries, choosing what we see, being aware of how it makes us feel.
And remembering that those apps are designed to keep us hooked, like those slot machines, always promising that next little dopamine hit.
Yeah, and a lot of it comes down to just being more aware, understanding how it all works. But it's not all about individuals' responsibility. We also talked about how important it is to communicate openly, especially with younger people.
Having those conversations with kids and teenagers about the potential risks, but also about how to develop good habits online. And most importantly, setting a good example ourselves. I mean, it's pretty hypocritical to tell your kid to put their phone down when you're always on yours.
Totally. And then there's the whole thing about face-to-face interaction. We can't forget about that with all the digital stuff going on.
Making time for real, genuine connection, putting our phones away, and being present in the moment. Those gulps of connection, like Chad Littlefield said.
Exactly. And, you know, with all the worries and anxieties, one thing that gave me some hope was that idea of digital flourishing. It came up in Teens Open Up.
Oh, yeah. It's like the opposite of all the doom and gloom. The idea that we can use technology, social media, included in a way that actually makes our lives better.
Instead of technology controlling us, we make technology work for us.
So how do we actually do that? How do we achieve this digital flourishing? What are some concrete steps we can take?
Well, a big part of it is being really clear about why we're using social media in the first place. What are we hoping to get out of it? Connection, information, entertainment.
Yeah. Once we know what we want, then we can be more careful about which platforms we use and what we choose to see. Like if I'm on Instagram and I'm feeling jealous or insecure, maybe that's a sign that I need to rethink what I'm looking at and why.
Right. And maybe switch to platforms or accounts that create a sense of community. Or give you inspiration, things that make you feel good instead of bad.
It's like we're talking about being more aware of what we're consuming, not just products, but information and experiences too.
Exactly. And that includes setting some healthy boundaries. We need to create space for those real-life interactions, those moments of genuine connection that make us feel good.
So things like having tech-free zones, setting screen time limits, making time for activities that we enjoy offline.
And sometimes it can be really helpful to just completely disconnect for a while. a digital detox, just to reset and reconnect with ourselves.
All of this is great advice. But how do we make sure that the next generation, the kids who are growing up surrounded by all this technology, develop healthy habits right from the start?
That's where digital literacy comes in. We need to give young people the critical thinking skills they need to navigate this complicated online world, teaching them how to evaluate sources, recognize misinformation, protect their privacy. Those are all essential skills these days.
So it's not just about saying get off your phone, it's about giving them the tools to be smart, informed, and responsible digital citizens.
Exactly. It's about empowering them to use technology for good, to create, connect, and make a positive difference.
Wow, we've covered a lot in this deep dive, from sips and gulps of connection to teenage anxieties to the possibility of digital flourishing. It's clear that social media is a powerful force that's changing how we communicate, for better or worse.
And it all comes down to this. Your relationship with social media should empower you, not control you.
So to wrap up this episode, we want to leave you with a few final thoughts. First, be aware, understand how social media works and how it can affect your thoughts, feelings, and actions.
Second, be intentional. Choose how you want to use social media and make sure it fits with your values and goals.
And finally, be kind to yourself and to others. We're all trying to figure out this crazy digital world together.
That's all for today's deep dive. We hope you found it interesting and got you thinking.
Until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and keep diving deep.